The air in the boardroom of Sterling Build and Design didn't smell like family. It smelled like cedarwood, expensive espresso, and cold clinical betrayal. My father, Arthur, sat behind his polished mahogany desk, leaning back with his fingers steepled the unearned confidence of a man who thought he'd already won the war before it even started. To his left, my mother, Evelyn, kept her CFO mask firmly in place, her eyes fixed on a tablet as if the spreadsheets held more life than the daughter standing in front of her. Just moments ago, they had slid a document across the glass table. A 65% pay cut. They called it restructuring. They called it sacrificing for the family legacy to cover the millions my brother, Julian, had bled out of our accounts with his incompetence. But I knew what it really was. A death sentence for my 5-year-old son's surgery. They were using Leo's hearing as a bargaining chip, betting that a desperate mother would never dare to walk away. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. The years of being the invisible daughter had taught me how to fold my fear into a sharp, internal blade. Instead, I reached into my bag and slid a thick manila envelope onto the table. The sound of paper meeting glass was sharp, like a bone snapping in a quiet room. "I've reviewed your offer," I said, my voice vibrating with a calm that seemed to unnerve them. "But I think you've miscalculated my worth. That is a licensing agreement." Arthur chuckled, that condescending rumble I'd heard my entire life. "Alara, be reasonable. Julian made a mistake with the Northridge bid, and we all have to tighten our belts. It's just business." "You're right, Dad. It is business," I replied, leaning forward until I could see my own tired reflection in the table. "And since you're using the eco-concrete formula I perfected in my garage on my own time, with my own money to save that very bid, you're going to pay for it, $5,000 a month, starting now. I just sent the invoice for Julian's new Porsche to my lawyer. If you want to fund his lifestyle, you won't do it with my son's future." The room went deathly silent. For the first time in 26 years, the power didn't belong to the CEO. It belonged to me. My name is Alara Vance, and for a long time, I believed my only job in this world was to keep the walls from falling down, literally. I am a structural designer, a person trained to calculate stress, tension, and the exact point where a beam fails under the weight of the world. But what they don't teach you in engineering school is how to measure the breaking point of a human heart, especially when the pressure is being applied by the very people who brought you into it. I am 26 years old. Yet, in the hierarchy of Sterling Build and Design, I have spent the last 7 years as little more than a silent, load-bearing pillar. I was the one who stayed late to fix the errors in Julian's reckless bids. I was the one who went to the muddy construction sites at dawn while my brother slept off his hangovers in a $1,000 silk sheet. I did it because I believed in the sanctity of a family legacy, and more importantly, because I needed the gold-plated insurance that came with my position. My 5-year-old son, Leo, lives in a world of profound silence. He was born with congenital hearing loss, and his life is a series of appointments, speech therapists, and a pending surgery for a cochlear implant that costs more than a mid-sized home in the suburbs. For years, my parents, Arthur and Evelyn, used that silence as a cage. They knew I wouldn't leave. They knew I wouldn't fight back, because a mother with a child who cannot hear the word "I love you" is a woman who can be bought cheaply. They mistook my maternal devotion for professional weakness, never realizing that the same discipline I used to design skyscrapers was being redirected into a meticulous 7-2-hour blueprint for their downfall. I'm telling you this story today, not just to vent the bitterness of a daughter betrayed, but to offer a promise to anyone who has ever felt like the extra in their own family. I am going to show you exactly how I took that humiliating 65% pay cut and turned it into the legal lever that pried the Sterling Empire out of my parents' hands. I want you to understand that when someone tries to trade your son's future for a luxury car, you stop being a daughter and you start being an architect. This is how I sued my own blood for every cent they stole, and how I finally built a life for Leo where he doesn't have to listen for the sound of his mother's fear. If you have ever been the one sacrificed so that a golden child could shine, I need you to stay with me. Like and subscribe, because the truth I'm about to reveal is the only thing Arthur and Evelyn couldn't buy their way out of. The disparity between my life and Julian's wasn't just a matter of bank balances, it was woven into the very fabric of our daily existence, a constant, quiet hum of injustice that my parents orchestrated with the precision of a symphony. Julian's office at Sterling Build and Design was a sanctuary of floor-to-ceiling glass and hand-stitched Italian leather, a place where the air always smelled of expensive cologne and unearned success. My office, for the better part of 7 years, was a dented metal trailer perched on the edge of a gravel pit or a folding chair in the back of a garage, where the scent of damp concrete and motor oil clung to my skin like a second layer of clothing. While Julian spent his afternoons networking at the country club, which was really just code for expensive lunches and 3 martini handshakes, I was the one climbing scaffolding in the rain, double-checking the load-bearing calculations he was too lazy to verify. Every time I dared to point out the imbalance, my mother, Evelyn, would offer that thin, rehearsed smile of hers, the one she used to silence me since I was a child. "Alara, dear, you have a natural grit," she would say, her voice as smooth and cold as a river stone. "Your brother has a more delicate, creative temperament. He needs the prestige to lead. You're the strong one. You've always been our rock." It was a brilliant, toxic trap. By labeling me the strong one, they effectively stripped me of the right to be tired, the right to be compensated, and the right to be hurt. They turned my competence into a reason to exploit me, and Julian's incompetence into a reason to reward him. I remember a specific Friday evening when the contrast became unbearable. I had just come from a site in Northridge, my boots caked in red clay, and my hands trembling from 10 hours of structural inspections. I stopped by the main office to drop off the final safety reports, the ones that would eventually save the Sterling reputation, only to see my parents and Julian through the glass of the executive lounge. They were clinking crystal glasses, celebrating a visionary project proposal that was, in reality, 90% my engineering and 10% Julian's font choices. I stood in the hallway, a dusty shadow in the periphery of their golden circle, watching my father clap Julian on the back with a pride he had never once directed at me. When I entered, Arthur didn't ask how the inspection went, or if I was exhausted. He simply glanced at my muddy shoes and frowned, as if my hard work was an aesthetic blemish on his pristine evening. In that moment, I realized that in the Sterling family, I wasn't a daughter, or even an employee. I was the invisible engine under the hood of a car Julian was allowed to drive into the ground. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet your phone battery is at 28% right now, right? If that's true, type 8. If not, type 9. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. I left the executive lounge that night, not with a scream, but with a silent, burning purpose that led me straight to my garage. For months, this drafty, oil-stained space had been my true office, far away from the sterile, deceptive hallways of Sterling Build and Design. While my parents were busy polishing Julian's image for the Northridge, a project that was currently bleeding money due to his logistical nightmares, I was knee-deep in buckets of experimental slurry and recycled carbon fibers. I was chasing a ghost, a fiber, reinforced, thermal insulating concrete formula that could cut production costs by 30% while exceeding every safety standard in the state. It was the kind of innovation that companies spend decades and millions trying to find, and I was birthing it between a rusted lawnmower and Leo's old tricycle. The work was grueling. My hands were perpetually cracked from the lye, and the scent of chemical additives had become my permanent perfume. But every time I felt my spirit falter, I would look over at the small wooden stool where Leo sat watching me. He couldn't hear the hum of the mixer or the scratching of my pen against the lab journal, but he felt the vibration of my determination. I wasn't just mixing chemicals, I was mixing his future. Every successful stress test was a step closer to the surgery that would open the world of sound to him. That garage was the only place where I wasn't a gnarng or a shadow. I was an alchemist, and I was winning. Finally, at 2:14 a.m., on a Tuesday, the curing samples reached their 28-day peak strength. I placed the cylinder into my homemade hydraulic press, my heart hammering against my ribs. When the dial hit the required PSI and the concrete refused to yield, I didn't cheer. I wept. It was perfect. I had found the miracle Arthur and Evelyn were desperately looking for to save the Northridge contract. In my exhausting naivety, I allowed a small, dangerous seed of hope to take root in my chest. I believed that if I walked into that boardroom and handed them this victory, if I saved the company Julian had nearly destroyed, they would finally see me. I thought this formula would be the currency I could use to buy my father's respect and my mother's love. I was ready to give it all to them, to hand over the fruit of my solitary labor, just to hear my father say, "Well done, Ilara." I didn't know then that I was merely prepping the stage for the most calculated betrayal of my life. I was bringing a diamond to a den of thieves, thinking they would appreciate its light, instead of just plotting how to steal it. Wednesday, October 14th, began with a deceptive sliver of hope. I had the test results from the garage tucked into a flash drive in my pocket, a digital miracle that I believed would finally bridge the chasm between my father's expectations and my reality. I walked into the executive suite at 9:30 a.m., my spine straight, smelling faintly of the industrial additives I'd spent all night mixing, ready to hand over the keys to the Northridge bid. I thought I was walking into my coronation. I didn't realize I was walking into an execution. Arthur didn't look up from his coffee when I entered, and Evelyn was already tapping away at her tablet, her face a mask of calculated, funereal solemnity. Julian was conspicuously absent, likely already at the dealership, signing for the life I was about to pay for. I began to present the curing data, my voice steady as I explained how the new concrete formula could recoup every cent the company had lost during Julian's logistical nightmares. I waited for the spark of recognition, the moment where Arthur would realize I had just handed him a $30 million lifeline. Instead, he simply sighed, a sound of weary disappointment that made the air in the room feel thin and freezing. Evelyn didn't even glance at the screen. She reached into a sleek leather folder and slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany table. It wasn't an appreciation letter. It was a formal amendment to my employment contract. My eyes skipped over the corporate jargon until they hit the number $32,200. My throat went bone dry. It wasn't just a pay cut. It was a 65% gutting of my life. "The firm is facing a liquidity crisis after the Northridge setback," Arthur said, his voice dripping with a rehearsed, paternal sorrow that I now recognized as his most dangerous weapon. "We've all had to make adjustments, Ilara. As a Sterling, you have to lead by example. We need that $60,000 back into the operating budget to keep the firm afloat for the sake of everyone's jobs." I stared at them, the flash drive in my pocket suddenly feeling like a hot coal. I knew the liquidity crisis was exactly the cost of Julian's new Porsche and his mounting debts, but the betrayal was so unvarnished that I momentarily forgot how to breathe. "What about Leo?" I whispered, the name of my son sounding fragile in that cold, expansive room. "The deductible for his surgery is $20,000. His speech therapy, my mortgage. I can't survive on this, and you know it." Evelyn finally looked up, her expression a terrifying blend of pity and steel. "Leo is our grandson, Ilara. We would never let anything happen to him. But if you choose to be selfish now, you're putting his health insurance at risk. If you walk away, the policy cancels at midnight. Think of your son's ears before you think of your pride." They weren't just cutting my pay. They were using my son's ability to hear as a ransom for my obedience. I looked at my parents' two pillars of family values and realized that to them, I was nothing more than a resource to be harvested until there was nothing left but the husk. I walked out of that glass-walled conference room feeling as though the air had been replaced by invisible smoke, thick with the stench of a betrayal I could no longer ignore. My parents' words, their calculated use of Leo's medical care, as a leash echoed in my mind, vibrating with a cruelty that didn't belong in a family, but rather in a high-stakes interrogation. I headed toward my desk, my hands trembling not with fear, but with a cold, clarifying rage. In the hallway, I nearly collided with Fiona Hayes, the administrative manager who had watched me grow from a clumsy intern into the person actually holding this firm together. She didn't say a word, but her face was pale, and she gestured toward the quiet corner of the records room. Without a sound, she slipped a folded piece of thermal paper into my hand, a leaked copy of a corporate disbursement she had processed, only an hour before my restructuring meeting. When I opened that paper in the privacy of the stairwell, the ink felt like it was burning my retinas. It was an invoice for a 2026 Porsche 911 Carrera, finished in jet black metallic. The total price, $125,000. The signature at the bottom, bold and unwavering, belonged to Evelyn Sterling. The date was October 14th today. The morning they looked me in the eye and told me the company was facing a liquidity crisis was the same morning they authorized a six-figure toy for my brother. The math was nauseatingly simple. My $60,000 salary sacrifice was essentially the down payment for Julian's midlife crisis. They weren't saving the company, they were cannibalizing my son's future to keep Julian's ego afloat. I didn't wait. I didn't strategize. I walked straight back into Arthur's office, bypassing his assistant, and slammed the invoice onto the mahogany desk. The sound was a gunshot in the sterile quiet. Arthur looked at the paper, then at me, and for a split second, I saw at the flicker of guilt, but it was swallowed instantly by a monolith of patriarchal arrogance. He didn't deny it. He didn't apologize. He simply stood up, his face hardening into a mask of terrifying coldness. Julian is the face of the new development wing. Elora, he barked, his voice dropping an octave into a threat. He needs to project success to the investors. It's an asset, a business expense. You, on the other hand, have become a liability with your constant demands and your domestic distractions. My son's surgery is not a distraction, Arthur, I said, the word dad officially dead in my mouth. It's his life. Then find another way to pay for it, he snapped, leaning over the desk until he was inches from my face. Since you want to act like an outsider, you can be one. You're done, Alara. Not just with the Northridge project, but with this company. You're blocked from the servers. Your keycard is void. And don't bother coming to Sunday dinner. If you can't be a team player, you aren't part of this family. Before I could respond, two security guards, men I'd shared coffee with for years, appeared at the door, their eyes downcast in shame. Arthur didn't just fire me, he exiled me. As I was escorted to the elevator, carrying nothing but my purse and the weight of 7 years of wasted loyalty, I felt the digital door slam shut as my phone buzzed with a notification, access denied to Sterling Cloud. They thought they had cut off my air supply. They didn't realize they had just released me from a burning building, and I was the one who still held the matches. The drive home from Sterling Build and Design felt like a funeral procession where I was both the deceased and the sole mourner. By the time I reached our small, rented house, the adrenaline that had fueled my confrontation with Arthur had evaporated, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a terrifying hollow chill. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, staring at the peeling paint on the garage door, the very place where I had birthed the miracle formula that was supposed to save us all. My phone buzzed one last time, with a notification from the company's HR portal. My health insurance benefits would terminate at 11:59 p.m. They weren't just letting me go. They were counting down the seconds until my son was left unprotected, a final, spiteful shove into the abyss. Inside, the house was quiet. Leo was at his small table, focused intently on a puzzle, his world as silent as the one my parents had just forced me into. I watched him for a long moment, my heart constricting. He didn't know that his mother was now unemployed, uninsured, and officially dead to the Sterling dynasty. He didn't know that the grandfather who had hugged him at Christmas was willing to let him stay in the dark to protect a reckless uncle's ego. I went into the garage and sat on that same wooden stool, surrounded by the buckets of gray slurry and the smell of industrial lye. The darkness of the room felt heavy, like it was pressing against my skin, demanding I succumb to the shadow identity my parents had crafted for me since birth. That was where Elias found me. He didn't turn on the overhead light. He just sat on the floor beside me, his presence a steady, warm anchor in the freezing tide of my exile. I told him everything: the Porsche, the 65% cut, the threat to Leo's insurance, and the security guards who escorted me out like a criminal. I expected him to be panicked, but instead, he reached out and took my hand, his thumb tracing the chemical burns on my knuckles. "Elara," he said, his voice low and unwavering, "they think they've taken your power because they took your keycard. But you are the one who built that formula. You are the one who understands the math of the Northridge bid. They have the building, but you have the foundation. And a building without a foundation is just a pile of expensive rubble." His words sparked something in the back of my mind, a memory of the intellectual property clause I had obsessed over weeks ago. I pulled my handwritten lab journals toward me, the pages filled with timestamps and dates that fell far outside the standard business hours Arthur so arrogantly relied upon. My parents had raised me to believe I was a cost, a gan narng, a liability to be managed. But as I looked at the data in the dim light of the garage, I realized I was actually their greatest creditor. They owed me for every late night, every saved project, and every ounce of my integrity they had tried to harvest. The darkness didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a bunker where I was preparing for the counterstrike. I picked up the phone and dialed Victor Thorne. It was time to stop being the daughter they could discard, and start being the architect they couldn't afford to lose. The morning after my exile didn't start with the sound of an alarm, but with the deafening clarity of a woman who had finally stopped trying to build a home inside a burning house. I woke up at 5:00 a.m., the familiar scent of garage lice still faintly clinging to my skin, but for the first time in 7 years, I didn't feel like a shadow preparing to serve Julian's light. Bdziewięć, 0 am. I was sitting in a corner booth of a quiet diner on the edge of the city, meeting Victor Thorne. He didn't offer me pity. He offered me a leather-bound folder containing the finalized provisional patent filings for my fiber, reinforced concrete formula. "The mode is built, Elara," he said, his voice as sharp and precise as a scalpel. "The moment they use a single cubic yard of that slurry on the Northridge project without your signature, they aren't just breaking a family bond, they're breaking federal law." I took that folder and drove straight to the headquarters of Cross-Continental Development. The building was a monolith of steel and glass that made the Sterling office look like a hobbyist's workshop. When I gave my name to the receptionist, I expected to be ignored or told to wait in the periphery, the way I had been for my entire career. Instead, the heavy oak doors of the executive suite opened within minutes, and Harrison Cross himself walked out to greet me. He didn't look at my age or my gender. He looked at the structural data I had sent him the night before. "I've spent 10 years looking for a way to stabilize recycled carbon fibers in a high thermal mix," he said, bypassing the small talk and leading me toward a gleaming, state-of-the-art laboratory. "Your garage trials didn't just solve a puzzle, Elara, they reshaped the market." Standing in that lab, surrounded by equipment that cost more than my parents' entire fleet of trucks, I felt the invisible daughter identity beginning to dissolve. Harrison offered me the Senior Director of Structural Innovation position with a starting salary of $210,000, more than double what Arthur had recently tried to slash to $32,000. But it wasn't the money that made my throat tighten. It was the way Harrison spoke to me. He used words like collaborator, innovator, and lead. He saw the architect, not the liability. As I signed the contract, I realized that my rebirth wasn't just about a new paycheck or a fancy title. It was about reclaiming the intellectual territory my parents had tried to annex as their own. I spent the rest of the afternoon outlining a research budget and meeting a team of 3 engineers who were assigned to me, not me supporting someone else's ego, but me setting the direction. When I left the building, the sun was beginning to set, casting long golden shadows across the pavement. For the first time, my own shadow looked substantial, grounded, and immovable. I was no longer a load-bearing pillar for a crumbling dynasty. I was the architect of a new empire, and the 7-2 hour clock I had set in Arthur's boardroom was now ticking toward 0. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. The 72nd hour arrived on a Friday morning that was far too bright and far too quiet. As I pulled into the familiar parking lot of Sterling Build and Design, I saw Julian's jet black metallic Porsche 911 parked defiantly in the executive spot A. My father's old spot. The car gleamed under the Connecticut sun, a $125,000 monument built from the rubble of my son's future. Inside the building, the air was thick with the scent of celebratory champagne and the frantic energy of a win that hadn't been earned. Today was the day the Northridge developers were arriving to sign the final contract, a $30 million deal that rested entirely on the back of the eco-concrete formula Arthur and Evelyn thought they had successfully extorted from me. They believed I was still at home, paralyzed by the fear of losing Leo's insurance, waiting for the midnight deadline to crawl back and sign their humiliating 65% pay cut. I didn't enter through the back employee entrance this time. I walked through the main glass doors, flanked by Victor Thorne and a legal courier from Cross Continental Development. The receptionist, the same one who had looked away when security escorted me out, now stared with her mouth half open as I bypassed her desk and headed straight for the executive boardroom. Through the glass walls, I saw them. Arthur, Evelyn, and Julian, sitting at the head of the table with the Northridge representatives, their pens hovering over a contract that was built on a lie. Arthur was in the middle of his favorite speech, the one about family integrity and innovative Sterling DNA. His fingers steepled with that same unearned confidence I had seen just 3 days ago. I opened the door without knocking. The silence that followed was so heavy it felt structural. Arthur's face went through a rapid, sickening transformation, from irritation at the interruption, to shock at seeing me, to a dark, purple rage when he realized I wasn't alone. "Alara," he barked, standing up so fast, his chair scraped, like a scream, against the hardwood. "This is a private closing. You were told your access was void. Leave now before I have you arrested." I didn't move. I didn't raise my voice. I simply gestured to Victor, who stepped forward and placed a formal cease and desist order on top of the Northridge contract. "The Sterling Group does not own the intellectual property mentioned in Section 4.2 of this bid," Victor said, his voice as cold and clinical as a surgeon's. "That formula is the sole property of Alara Vance, filed under provisional patent 72 hours ago. Any use of this technology in your manufacturing process constitutes a willful infringement." Julian's face went pale, the arrogant smirk disappearing as he looked from the contract to the Porsche keys sitting on the table. Evelyn reached for the document, her CFO mask finally cracking to reveal the panic beneath. The Northridge developers pulled their hands back from the pens, as if they were made of fire, their eyes darting between my father's trembling hands and my steady gaze. The collision had happened. The Sterling Empire hadn't just hit a wall. It had hit the foundation I had taken with me when I walked out the door. The silence in the boardroom was no longer the heavy, oppressive quiet of my obedience. It was the vacuum created when a massive, decade-long lie is suddenly sucked out of a room. Miss Henderson, the lead developer from Northridge, leaned back and placed his silver fountain pen on the table with a sharp, final click, a sound that echoed like a gavel. He looked at the cease and desist order, then at my father's trembling hands, and finally at me. For the first time in my life, I wasn't being looked through. I was being seen as the most powerful person in the room. "Arthur," Mr. Henderson said, his voice dropping into a tone of profound professional disgust. "You told us this technology was developed in-house, fully vetted, and owned by Sterling Build and Design. You didn't mention it was a contested asset birthed in a garage by a daughter you were currently trying to starve out of her own career." My father tried to find his voice, but it came out as a thin, desperate rasp. "This is a family misunderstanding, Jim. Alara is. She's emotional. She doesn't understand that as a Sterling, her work belongs to the firm. We can resolve this privately." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for me to return to the shadow he had built for me, but the invisible daughter was dead. "It's not a misunderstanding, and it's certainly not private anymore," I said, my voice projecting with a clarity I had only ever felt when calculating the load-bearing limits of a skyscraper. I walked around the table, standing directly behind Julian, who was staring at the keys of his Porsche as if they were a ticking bomb. "You didn't build a legacy, Arthur. You built a hostage, Ting Huang. You used my son's hearing as a ransom to fund this lifestyle." I gestured toward the window where the jet-black metallic Porsche sat in the sun, a $125,000 monument to their greed. "You told me the company was in a liquidity crisis on Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, you had authorized a six-figure payout for a car Julian can't even afford to insure without my salary cut." Evelyn tried to intervene, her CFO mask shattered, her face showing a blend of panic and a lifetime of habituated manipulation. "Alara, think of what this will do to the family name. Think of Leo's future." "I am thinking of Leo's future," I replied, looking directly at her. "I'm making sure he never grows up believing that family means being a resource for people who don't love you. I'm making sure he never has to sit at a table 14 next to the trash while the people he trusts most feast on his hard work." Victor Thorne then opened the second folder. Displaying the internal logs, Fiona Hayes had provided the paper trail of their financial misconduct and the proof that Julian had been taking credit for my structural designs for years. The other board members, who had spent years nodding along to Arthur's sermons on integrity, began to pull away. They saw the liability I had become, not a liability to the business, but to the lie they were all living in. Mr. Henderson stood up, followed by his entire team. "The Northridge bid is suspended pending a full legal review of your intellectual property rights, Arthur," he announced. "And frankly, I don't do business with men who view their own children as disposable expenses." As they walked out, the room felt as though it were physically collapsing, the polished mahogany and the leather chairs losing their prestige. I stood at the head of the table, the licensing agreement in one hand and my dignity in the other. I had stripped them of their power, not by shouting, but by simply holding up a mirror to the architecture of their betrayal. The boardroom didn't feel like a temple of industry anymore. It felt like a crime scene where the evidence was finally being read aloud. Victor Thorne didn't rush. He moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a man who knew he held every single ace in the deck. He opened the second manila folder, the one that held the unauthorized history of my genius. He systematically laid out the receipts for the chemicals I'd bought with my own credit card, the time-stamped photos of my curing samples in the garage, and the logs from my home mixer that proved the breakthrough happened at 3:00 a.m. on a Sunday, not during the standard business hours my father so arrogantly claimed to own. Arthur was slumped in his chair, the patriarchal armor finally riddled with holes. He looked at the documents as if they were written in a language he no longer understood. Evelyn was worse. She was calculating the legal fees in her head, her CFO brain realizing that the restructuring she had designed to fund Julian's vanity was now the very noose around the company's neck. The liquidity crisis they had invented to rob me was now a self-fulfilling prophecy. As the Northridge deal, the only thing keeping the Sterling name relevant, evaporated in the face of my legal claims. "Here is the reality," I said, my voice cutting through the stifling air of the room with a surgical precision. "The Northridge developers are gone. Your reputation in this city is currently in a tailspin, and you have exactly 48 hours before the formal patent infringement suit is filed with the federal court." I leaned over the table, looking directly into my mother's eyes. The eyes that had watched me work for 7 years and chose to see a liability instead of a daughter. "But I'm not as cruel as you are. I'll give you a way out. You sign the licensing agreement, $5,000 a month, per formula. Every month, on the 1st, for as long as Sterling Build and Design exists." The irony was a physical weight in the room. $5,000. It was the exact amount they had tried to strip from my monthly paycheck to pay for a Porsche I hadn't asked for and a brother I had spent my life protecting. I was taking back the ransom they had placed on my son's future. Julian finally broke the silence, his voice high and reedy, stripped of its usual bravado. "You can't do this, Alara. We're family. I have payments. The car. The apartment." He looked at the keys to the Porsche 911 sitting on the table, the jet black metallic toy that was supposed to be the face of the new wing. "Give them to me, Julian," I said. He hesitated, looking at Arthur, but my father couldn't even meet his gaze. With a trembling hand, Julian slid the keys across the table. The metal clinked against the glass, a small, pathetic sound that marked the end of his unearned era. "The Porsche is going back to the dealership tomorrow morning," I continued, sliding the keys into my bag. "The refund will cover the first 3 months of my licensing fee and the immediate costs of Leo's surgery. After that, you pay the $5,000, or I pull the license and let Northridge sue you into the dirt for using a stolen asset in their bid." Evelyn signed first. Her hand was shaking so badly, the signature looked like a jagged scar across the page. Arthur followed, his pen scratching against the paper with a sound of utter defeat. They didn't look at me as they pushed the signed licensing agreement back across the table. They had lost the company's crown jewel, their golden child's plaything, and their daughter's silence in a single stroke. I took the folder, felt its substantial weight, and realized that for the first time in 26 years, the debt between us had finally been settled in full. 3 months later, the only calculation that mattered wasn't the load-bearing limit of a steel beam, but the precise frequency of a whisper. I sat in the recovery room of the specialty clinic, the air no longer smelling of industrial lye, but of sterile hope and the faint scent of the lavender cookies my mother had brought. Leo sat on the bed, his head bandaged, his eyes wide with a confusion that was about to turn into a miracle. When the audiologist finally activated the implant and whispered his name, Leo didn't just flinch. He turned toward me and let out a soft, distorted mama. In that moment, every late night in the garage, every chemical burn on my knuckles, and every humiliating word Arthur and Evelyn had ever thrown at me became nothing more than the dust of a demolished building. My life at Cross-Continental Development has become a sanctuary of professional respect. I no longer spend my days fixing Julian's errors or apologizing for my own existence. I spend them leading a team that values the math of my mind as much as the integrity of my character. The $5,000 monthly licensing fee from Sterling Build and Design arrives like clockwork, a recurring reminder that my parents now exist on the periphery of my life, governed by a contract they were forced to sign. They are allowed to visit Leo, but they do so in my home, under my rules, and they have learned that their CEO titles hold no currency at my kitchen table. I am 30 now, a mother, a director, and finally, the sole architect of my own identity. I've learned that setting a boundary isn't an act of revenge. It is the most vital structural support a woman can build for herself. I don't hate my parents anymore. Hating them would mean giving them space in my foundation that they no longer deserve. I simply view them as a cautionary tale of what happens when you value a jet black metallic image over the flesh and blood that sustains you. Tonight, as I tucked Leo into bed, he pointed to the bookshelf my father had built from barnwood, the only piece of the old world I chose to keep. He touched my face and imitated the sound of the wind outside. He is no longer a liability or a shadow. He is a boy who can finally hear the world, and I am the woman who made sure he never had to sit at a table 14. I walked out of his room, closed the door softly, and realized that for the first time in my life, the house I live in is built on nothing but the truth. We are taught from childhood that family is a sanctuary, a place where the walls are thick enough to keep out the storm, and the foundation is built on unconditional love. But for many, the sterling build and designs of the world are not sanctuaries. They are prisons built from the bricks of our own sacrifices. Alara's story is a profound reminder that family loyalty should never be a one-way street paved with your own erasure. The most dangerous lie told in toxic families is that your worth is a variable to be managed, a resource to be harvested until there is nothing left but the husk. When those who are supposed to protect you begin to trade your children's futures for their own vanity, they are no longer family, They are creditors of your soul. Resilience, as Alara showed us, is not about how much pain you can absorb. It is about the moment you stop trying to fix the cracks in a broken dynasty and start building your own foundation. It is the realization that boundaries are not acts of revenge, they are acts of survival. Setting a limit with a manipulative parent is not an act of hate. It is an act of love for the person you were meant to become before they tried to tell you otherwise. To the women standing in their own garages tonight, mixing the chemicals of their own rebirth, do not confuse your silence with obedience. Your value is not determined by those who profit from your underpayment, whether that is in a boardroom or at a kitchen table. You are the architect, you are the lead, and you deserve a life where your voice is never treated as a domestic distraction. What would you have done if you were in Alara's shoes? Would you have ever opened the door for Arthur and Evelyn again, or would that licensing agreement have been your final word? Leave a comment below. I read every single one of your stories. If this journey resonated with you, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We share these slices of life every week to remind you that you are never alone in the silence.